Thank you for making the trek from WA to be here. I have some questions in relation to some petroleum licences in the Great Australian Bight.
Yes.
You'll be aware that Equinor have decided to pull out. I assume there's not many title holders left in the Bight.
Senator, I should start. Graham Waters, National Offshore Petroleum Titles Administrator. Yes, we were advised last week by Equinor their decision to move out of operations from the Bight. There are still a number of title holders in the Bight.
What happens to Equinor's title? Is that now just simply...
The two titles it holds, one has a well obligation in the primary term, one doesn't. The titles are still in compliance with their work programs as at now. Presumably they will fall into non-compliance, and at that point I will advise the Joint Authority accordingly.
Sorry, can you speak up a bit? You'll advise the Joint Authority...
I beg your pardon?
You'll advise the Joint Authority to...
There is... Depending on what action Equinor may take from here, but at some point into the future, I presume that what will happen is the titles will fall into non-compliance, and at that point I will advise the Joint Authority of that, and the Joint Authority then may make a decision to cancel the titles.
Okay. Are there any other titles other than 41 and 42?
Yes.
There are, and they're still active?
Thank you. Thank you for that. There are 6 active exploration permits in the Great Australian Bight. Equinor hold 2 of them, Bight Petroleum hold another 2, and Santos and Murphy in a joint venture hold one other, and then Karoon Energy holds the 6th.
Okay, I'm going to talk about 41 and 42, which are the 2 that are closest to Port Lincoln.
Yes.
And I won't in any way ambush you with where I'm coming from. I have people in Port Lincoln who are very concerned about that. And when I talk about people, I'm talking about the fishing industry.
Yes.
And the tourism industry, who are holding back on investment because of these titles sitting there. Now, in relation to these 2 titles, we know that there was to be a seismic survey carried out. My understanding is that the title holder, or PGS, whoever was conducting the seismic survey, has notified the government that they're not intending now to carry out that seismic survey.
I
know it's kind of a not seen thing.
I'm trying to work out which part of the answer I can address. Yes, PGS currently hold an environmental approval to carry out seismic survey in that area.
Okay, so where the problem lies, and this is really what I want to explore, is I've looked at these permits, and there are multiple suspensions and extensions.
Yes.
And so you've got a company that's sitting there suspending, seeking a suspension of their activities, then perhaps re-engaging, extending timelines.
Yes.
All the while, there are other industries that are being kept in abeyance, unsure about investment and so forth. So my questions basically go to when these things are approved. EP 41, grant of title on 7 July 2011 for 6 years. They then had a suspension and an extension very shortly thereafter. There's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 suspensions and extensions, and there's just as many in respect of 41 and in respect of 42. There are certain rules that the Joint Authority must consider, or certain things that the Joint Authority must consider in respect of granting an extension. Is that not correct?
Yes.
And they're defined in law under the Act, or is it or regulation?
It's under the provision. The Joint Authority may consider a broad range of things, not necessarily constrained by the Act. I advise the Joint Authority as to matters within the Act and in accordance with the guidelines that are published to provide assistance to organisations in their applications.
Okay, but in reality, there are not that many reasons for an extension or a suspension or an extension. One of them is force majeure.
Yes.
Has anyone sought to make a claim of force majeure in relation to either of those titles?
Senator, in answering your question, I don't seek to make you cranky, but there are
It happens all
issues.
the time. It won't be personal. Okay?
There are issues contained within the applications that it would be inappropriate for me to speak specifically about them.
Are you talking about? I'm talking going back to 2011,
Yeah.
and
So,
I will not accept any commercial sensitivities in respect of decisions made as far back as then.
So if perhaps I will attempt to answer your question in general.
So I just want to be really clear that secrecy provisions that might be in enactments do not apply in relation to questions asked in the Senate. The only thing you can do is offer a public interest immunity, and there's a strong balance in terms of public interest in having the public understand what's going on here, because I think what's going on here is there's a cosy little arrangement taking place where you are in effect simply letting companies renew beyond the arrangements that are in the Act. And if you don't disclose those sorts of things to the Senate, then I'm going to call you out for hiding something.
Senator Patrick, I think allow the official to answer. I believe Mr. Lawson has something to add, but
Sure.
Mr. Waters, please go ahead with your answer.
There should be transparency in relation to this.
Yes, so, and I will attempt to demonstrate that.
Sure.
The applications that we receive from companies in things like suspensions, applications, variations to work programs, routinely disclose commercial strategies. And it's important that we receive that kind of information to make a proper assessment in order to advise the Joint Authority. We encourage and require companies to make that kind of information available to us, which is why I'm being reluctant to talk about commercial strategies. Now, the types of commercial strategies I'm talking about relate to a balance between the nature of the work program, and in this case we're talking about undertaking seismic surveys. These have largely, over the last few years, have become very seasonal in the way that they're conducted. There are only certain windows throughout the course of the calendar year when they can be done, either through concerns for maritime issues, environmental issues, or just the weather prevailing at the time. That's one aspect. The other aspect that the companies are dealing with are the availabilities of the seismic vessels to shoot the seismic. Now, that routinely involves entering into contracts. These vessels aren't routinely floating around Australia's shores. They are coming from other jurisdictions. And so a company needs to look at the mobilisation costs and then the demobilisation costs post-seismic. And then the companies that are involved in providing the seismic vessels to do the work, they have those other considerations to take into account as well. It becomes, for want of a better term, a juggling act. And quite often we see companies describing to us their difficulty in contracting vessels. Now, when they can dovetail these to other companies with other activities in other parts of the Australian offshore area, then that becomes far more straightforward.
So does the fishing industry get to have input to these decisions? Does the tourism industry get to have input to these decisions?
So, Senator, perhaps I can go to some of that. Not to provide their advice within their constraint, but the Joint Authority, the two ministers, the Commonwealth Minister and the State Minister, can take other matters into account. And so people can make submissions to those. And I have to say we would be very pleased to assist with that process, because I think it's a legitimate issue for other interested parties that may be affected by extensions or otherwise. That's advice that we as a policy department should provide can provide to the ministers, and make sure that the ministers are aware of those issues and take them into account in making the decisions. What the NOPTA does is they're part of the exercise. They don't look at these issues, but the ministers certainly can, and one might argue should, and we're the right people to
Okay,
brief.
so to help my constituents out in South Australia, I was at a hearing last week and I was told that there was currently an extension or some decision on foot in respect of the joint authority. Is that in relation to these two?
There is a current application under consideration by the Joint Authority in respect of a variation for an above work commitment activity.
Okay, so in that respect, have we sought consultation from industries to provide input to the Minister?
If we haven't, we certainly will now.
Well, look, and that's a good thing, but
Yeah.
my point is maybe we need to be more
Yes.
active
Yeah.
in looking at other industries that may be affected by this, that may be impacted by this, and rather than compartmentalising it and only considering the commercial factors associated with the title holder.
So, Senator, if I could try to be of some assistance here, one of the unique features of the Joint Authority, there is no other jurisdiction in the world that has anything remotely like that. I advise on technical issues as well as compliance with regard to the OPGGS Act. The Joint Authority may consider all of those things that the Deputy Secretary just referred to, and the Joint Authority consists of a Commonwealth Minister and a State Minister. And that is one of the powers of the Joint Authority, in that specific local issues relevant to that state jurisdiction, obviously here South Australia, the state member of the Joint Authority is well placed to hear from constituents within that jurisdiction on the very issues you're talking about.
Okay, so my concern goes to whether or not those other interested parties are given notice to make representations. Now, in some sense, you are compiling information in a brief to go to the Joint Authority. Maybe that's the point at which you seek input from other interested parties, or do you only look at the interests of the title holder and rely on the ministers to get input from other industries?
No, look, my role is quite specific. I am there to provide technical advice as it relates to the activity that's being proposed to be undertaken.
So I have to get cranky at Mr. Lawson then.
Yeah, so I think, indeed, Senator, I think what we're identifying is that the NOPTA website advertises that these things are happening, but
Yeah.
it doesn't provide a link to us to say,
Yeah.
if you want to, if you're not, technically the title holder,
Yeah.
if you have views, who should they contact? So I think we can sort of arrange to make that change.
And maybe we can take this offline. You obviously need to solve a more general problem,
Yeah.
but for this specific case, I've got people in
So
Port Lincoln that really would
So Senator,
like to
I'm
make
sure my minister will be wanting me to say to you that we want to work cooperatively with you to make sure that that these issues are addressed, both in the sense of the specific issue, and I think you've identified a more general issue that Graham does his thing, so
Yeah.
the not titles advisor does
Yeah.
his thing. The policy folk should be actively engaging with other interested parties to make sure that they have an opportunity to put their...
And on this wave of unanimity, shall we
Yeah.
leave it there?
Yeah, I'll just put the case of my constituents
Yep.
that the continual prolonging of these licences is of great concern to them.